From the outside, her life looked flawless. A mansion, wealth, success, everything the world believes equals happiness. But behind the glittering walls lived a truth no one could see, a truth shaped by silence, neglect, and a quiet pain that refused to disappear. For months, she faded into the background, unseen in her own home, until one moment, one photo, shattered the illusion and exposed a reality no one was ready to face. Keep watching and subscribe now, because what happens next will leave you speechless.
She woke each morning to a house that echoed with quiet distance, a place that looked magnificent to the world yet felt colder with every passing day. And as she moved through the vast foyer and grand hallways, the polished floors reflected not joy but emptiness, reminding her how deeply silence can cut when it replaces connection. The tall windows let in rays of sunlight that stretched across the marble and glass, yet even the brightness failed to soften the weight pressing inside her chest, the heavy awareness that something essential had slipped away long before anyone noticed. Life in that mansion had once been imagined as a symbol of success, partnership, and unity, a life shared, a future built together, yet instead it slowly transformed into a space where she felt more like a shadow drifting quietly in the background than a living soul who deserved presence, love, or acknowledgement. From the outside, people believed she lived a dream life, admired from a distance by strangers who saw only luxury, not the loneliness hidden beneath it. And only she understood how easily a beautiful world could become a cage when love fades into neglect and respect dissolves into silence. She carried herself with dignity each morning, her steps soft yet determined, because even within isolation she held onto the roots of who she was, a woman shaped by heritage, strength, and resilience. Yet the quiet ache inside her grew heavier as days blurred together. The emptiness surrounding her was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, quiet, and constant, lingering in the spaces where conversation should have existed, in the places where warmth should have lived, and in the moments where mutual care should have grown instead of disappearing. She walked past portraits, polished stair rails, gleaming chandeliers, and carefully curated decor, yet none of it reflected belonging. Instead, it mirrored the distance between the image the world admired and the truth she lived. She remembered a time when she believed this place would feel alive, when she expected laughter to fill the rooms, footsteps to echo with connection, and each day to feel shared instead of endured, but the silence that now lived within those walls spoke louder than any sound could have. The mansion felt too large for one heart to occupy alone, and every corner reminded her that presence without acknowledgement can feel colder than emptiness itself. She tried to steady herself against the quiet, telling her spirit to remain strong, to hold on to hope, to believe that distance could fade and understanding might return. Yet with every passing morning, the truth became harder to ignore. The world might have seen perfection when looking at her life, but perfection meant nothing when it was built upon isolation. And deep inside, she began to sense that the silence was no longer temporary. It was becoming the story of her existence within a world that looked radiant on the surface but felt unbearably hollow within. She stood beside the tall window where the sunlight poured in, and although the warm beams stretched softly across the polished floor and onto her skin, they could not erase the quiet ache that rested in her expression. The ache of someone who had grown used to being present yet unseen. The glass reflected a world that appeared peaceful from the outside, wide lawns, sculpted gardens, perfectly aligned pathways, but the view felt distant, almost unreal, like a picture belonging to a life that should have felt meaningful but instead drifted further away from her with every passing day. As she looked outward, she was reminded that people admired this world from afar, believing it represented comfort, success, and fulfillment, unaware that beneath its beauty lived a silence that pressed against her heart until it became impossible to ignore. She traced the faint outline of light across the window pane and thought about how life inside these walls once promised connection, how she once believed the future here would be shared instead of lonely, how she imagined belonging rather than invisibility. Yet slowly, quietly, the distance had grown until it formed something much heavier than solitude, something that felt like erasure. She carried her identity with pride, rooted in culture, strength, and history, yet the environment around her kept attempting to smooth those edges, to soften who she was, to reshape her presence into something quieter and less noticeable. And each time it happened, a small part of her spirit felt dimmed. The subtle shifts began as moments she tried to ignore, a conversation that moved past her voice without pause, a decision made without her presence, gestures that brushed aside her perspective, but patterns have a way of revealing truth once they repeat long enough. What first appeared as emotional distance evolved into a quiet form of dismissal, unfolding so gradually that even she struggled to see it until it wrapped itself around her days completely. Standing there by the window, she realized how deeply that pattern had shaped her life, turning ordinary interactions into reminders that she existed in a world that expected her to endure quietly rather than be heard. Outside, the sunlight was bright, but inside, the air felt still and heavy. The house did not echo with conversation or shared laughter. Instead, it carried a silence that lingered in every corner, a silence that felt intentional in its refusal to acknowledge her presence. She felt the unspoken expectations pressing against her, expectations that told her to remain composed, graceful, accommodating, to hold strength without recognition and resilience without support. Expectations shaped not only by wealth and status but by deeper, unspoken biases about whose voice deserved to matter. She sensed how easily her identity was minimized in this space, how quickly she was reduced to a quiet symbol rather than a person with emotion, depth, and history, and that realization brought a weight that no luxury could silence. She had once entered this life believing partnership meant equality, believing love meant acknowledgement, respect, and shared existence. But as the days continued, she discovered that proximity did not guarantee connection and presence did not promise visibility. Even as she stood in the same rooms, lived under the same roof, and walked through the same world, she felt herself drifting further away from the center of her own life, watching from the edge as decisions unfolded without her, as moments passed where she should have mattered but instead faded into the background. The window became more than just a place she looked through. It became a symbol of separation, dividing what the world believed about her life from the truth she carried quietly within. And in that moment, she could feel how the silence was no longer accidental, no longer a passing phase, but something carefully maintained. A distance that existed not only between two people but between who she was and how she was allowed to exist within this space. She thought about how easily others dismissed the impact of that erasure, how they saw privilege and assumed protection, how they believed comfort erased pain, never realizing that isolation can be even more piercing when it is hidden beneath perfection. She knew that if her story were ever spoken aloud, many would question it, soften it, or reinterpret it, because people often struggle to see injustice when it does not appear in loud, obvious ways. But standing there, with the light touching her skin and the quiet pressing in around her, she could no longer deny what she felt. The life others envied had become a place where her presence went unnoticed, where her humanity felt discounted, where her worth was acknowledged only in silence, and that realization marked the beginning of a truth she could no longer bury beneath composure. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in the strength she still carried, the resilience that lived within her history, the dignity she refused to surrender, even as the world around her tried to shape her into something smaller. The illusion of perfection remained visible to everyone else, but inside her spirit, something had begun to awaken, a quiet awareness, a rising clarity, a recognition that the distance surrounding her was not only painful, it was unjust. And although she did not yet know where that awareness would lead, she knew one thing with certainty. The silence that once felt bearable now felt impossible to ignore, and the life she stood in was no longer a reflection of who she truly was, but a reminder of how deeply she longed to be seen, valued, and acknowledged, not as a symbol, but as a human being whose existence deserved more than quiet pain hidden behind polished glass. A cinematic overhead feeling seemed to echo through her daily routine, much like the long, empty dining table she walked past each morning, a table built for shared moments, for conversation and connection, yet now representing the emotional distance that shaped every part of her life. She would sit at one end, her presence calm and dignified, surrounded by a silence that felt heavier with each passing day, while the opposite end remained untouched, a physical reminder of the widening gap between what life appeared to be and what it truly was. The polished surface reflected soft lighting and expensive decor, but beneath that elegance lived an ache that words could not fully express, the ache of knowing that love had faded into habit, that companionship had transformed into absence, that she existed alongside another life without ever being included within it. The space between where she sat and where he should have been felt larger than the distance across the table. It felt like a divide carved by months of neglect, shaped by patterns of dismissal that could no longer be ignored. Each meal became a quiet ritual of endurance rather than nourishment, a moment where isolation wrapped itself around her like an unwelcome shadow. She would place her hands gently on the table, breathe slowly, and remind herself that she still had worth, even when the world around her refused to reflect it. The room felt staged, almost theatrical, as if she was expected to continue playing a role in a story written by someone else, a story where she existed in silence so that the illusion of perfection could remain unbroken. The emptiness in the space was not simply about absence. It was about erasure, about the emotional distance that replaced connection, about the unspoken message that her presence was no longer essential in a life she once believed was shared. Her days followed that same rhythm of quiet separation. The mansion was full of rooms yet empty of meaning, each space echoing the pattern of distance that now defined her reality. She moved through hallways where footsteps felt too loud for the silence surrounding them, where every decorative detail reminded her of how much effort had been invested in appearance while so little care had been given to the emotional foundation beneath it. She tried to remind herself of the strength she carried, of the resilience rooted in her identity, yet strength does not erase loneliness, it only teaches you how to endure it without collapsing. There were moments when she would pause at the edge of the dining room and imagine what life here was supposed to feel like: shared laughter, warm conversation, an atmosphere built on respect, care, and partnership. Instead, the reality she faced was one where she existed in the background of her own life, expected to remain poised and composed while enduring emotional abandonment disguised as circumstance. The silence sitting across from her felt intentional, a choice rather than an accident, and that truth began to settle deep within her spirit. The imbalance of power in the relationship became clearer the longer she sat alone in that space. Everything around her reflected stability and success, yet emotional connection, the very foundation of partnership, had been replaced with distance that carried undertones of dismissal and quiet disregard. She understood now that neglect does not always appear as cruelty. Sometimes it appears as absence, as indifference, as the slow fading of acknowledgement until one person is left carrying the weight of a relationship alone. And within that neglect, she felt something deeper. The subtle echo of racial bias woven into the dynamics of silence, the expectation that she should remain strong, composed, and unquestioning, even while being erased in the very space she helped build. She could feel how her role in that world had shifted from partner to presence, from equal to symbol, from valued to tolerated. The distance across that table mirrored the distance between how she saw herself and how she was treated, a distance that grew wider each time her feelings were ignored, each time her humanity went unrecognized beneath the surface of wealth and image. She realized that the silence surrounding her was not neutral. It existed within a structure that allowed her voice to be minimized while ensuring everything else appeared flawless to the outside world. Yet even in that isolation, she refused to lose herself. She grounded her spirit in memory, in the knowledge of where she came from, in the love and resilience that shaped her identity, in the strength passed through generations who had also endured invisibility in different forms. She reminded herself that her existence carried meaning, even when the environment around her tried to diminish it. But resilience does not erase pain, it simply allows you to stand while carrying it. As she sat there, alone yet composed, she began to understand that the emotional separation reflected more than just personal neglect. It revealed an imbalance shaped by power, perception, and unspoken expectation. It was a reminder that injustice does not always shout. Sometimes it lives quietly in intimate spaces, hidden beneath elegance, concealed behind politeness, disguised as routine. The world might have seen perfection in that dining room, but she saw the truth, a truth that whispered of erasure, of imbalance, of a love that no longer recognized her humanity. And though she continued to sit with dignity, something inside her had begun to awaken, a slow awareness, a rising clarity, a quiet recognition that the distance around her was not simply sorrow to endure, but a reality that demanded to be understood, confronted, and someday, no longer accepted. She found herself standing before the mirror, the quiet reflection staring back at her revealing more truth than any conversation ever had, and in that still moment she saw not just her face, but the emotional journey etched softly into her expression, the exhaustion of carrying unspoken pain, the strength of surviving invisibility, and the quiet dignity she refused to surrender even while being erased inside a life that was supposed to honor her presence. The soft light around her traced faint lines of weariness beneath her calm composure, and she realized how deeply the silence had shaped her spirit, slowly dimming the light she once carried so freely. The mirror no longer showed only what others expected to see: elegance, grace, composure. It revealed the truth that lived beneath those layers, the truth of a woman who had remained strong for too long in a space that offered her nothing in return but distance. She remembered the woman she once was before the silence began, hopeful, expressive, full of dreams about what partnership and unity were supposed to feel like within these walls. She once believed this place would reflect love, warmth, and belonging, a space where her identity could exist freely without being softened or restrained to fit into expectations crafted by someone else's comfort. But as she looked into her own eyes, she saw how that hope had been slowly replaced with restraint, how her voice had been quieted over time, how her sense of self had been reduced to quiet endurance. The realization felt heavy yet unmistakable. She had not simply become distant. She had been pushed into silence, shaped by an environment that valued image over truth and control over humanity. She stood still, breathing slowly as memories surfaced, moments when she had tried to speak only to be overlooked, moments when her feelings were softened to avoid discomfort, moments when her presence was treated as an accessory rather than a partner. Each memory echoed through the reflection like fragments of a story she had been forced to live quietly. What first appeared as emotional neglect now revealed itself as something far deeper, a pattern rooted in dismissal, in imbalance, in the unspoken belief that her voice mattered less than the illusion of perfection surrounding them. The phone rested gently in her hand, almost symbolic now, the same device where she had begun capturing fragments of her existence in silent images, proof that she was still here even when she was treated as though she were fading into the background. Those photos were never taken for admiration or approval. They were taken for survival, for remembrance, for affirmation of worth in a world where acknowledgement had been withheld. Looking at herself now, she understood why those images mattered so much. They preserved the truth that others ignored. They held the strength she carried beneath the isolation. They reminded her that her identity did not vanish simply because others refused to see it. She saw dignity in her reflection, not the dignity others expected her to wear for appearance, but the dignity born from resilience, from enduring silently without losing herself entirely. Yet she also saw tenderness, vulnerability, the quiet ache of someone who had spent too long convincing herself that endurance was the only choice she had. The mirror revealed both, the strength that allowed her to stand and the pain that had grown heavier with time, pressing against her spirit until it could no longer remain hidden. It was then she realized that the silence had not just lived in the house. It had begun to live inside her, shaping the way she moved, the way she held herself, the way she measured her worth in a space where acknowledgement was withheld. She understood now that invisibility does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through small dismissals, subtle exclusions, and quiet expectations that teach you to shrink yourself for the sake of keeping peace. And as she faced her reflection, she knew she could no longer pretend that this invisibility was acceptable. Her identity, rich with history, culture, resilience, and strength, had never belonged to a world that tried to soften or diminish it. She remembered the values she was raised with, the stories of those who came before her, the lessons of courage and self-respect passed through generations. Those memories grounded her, reminding her that she was never meant to disappear inside someone else's story. The awareness rising within her was not anger. It was clarity, a realization that what she had endured was not just personal loss but a reflection of something much larger. The quiet ways bias can exist inside relationships disguised as normalcy, hidden inside emotional neglect. Her breath steadied as she continued to hold her gaze in the mirror, refusing to look away from her own truth. The room around her seemed to fade into silence, leaving only that moment of confrontation between who she had become and who she refused to stop being. She saw both pain and power in her reflection, the heartbreak of erasure and the strength of a woman who still stood despite it. And she understood that this moment was not just about seeing herself, it was about finally recognizing the depth of what she had endured. She was no longer simply surviving the silence. She was witnessing it, naming it, acknowledging its impact in a way she had never allowed herself to before. And with that acknowledgement came the first quiet spark of transformation, not loud, not immediate, but undeniable, a shift beneath the surface that told her something within her life could not continue as it was. The mirror no longer reflected only who she appeared to be, it reflected the beginning of who she was becoming. Even though she did not yet know what change would look like or where it would lead, she knew one truth now with absolute certainty. She could no longer allow her existence to be defined by invisibility, no longer allow her voice to be softened for the sake of silence, no longer allow herself to disappear inside a world that refused to see her. And in that quiet, reflective moment, standing alone yet stronger than she had ever realized, she began to understand that the story she was living was not finished. It was only beginning to awaken. She moved through the hallway with steady, measured steps, the soft echo of her footsteps trailing behind her like a reminder of how empty the house had become. And as she walked past tall walls and polished frames, she felt the weight of routine pressing against her spirit, a routine that no longer felt like living, but like existing in silence. Each day followed the same quiet pattern, not because life lacked structure, but because connection had been replaced with distance, leaving her to navigate spaces that were meant to be shared yet now belonged to solitude. The hallway, long and elegant, stretched ahead of her like a path through absence, and every time she crossed it, she was reminded that she was moving through a world where her presence was expected, but rarely acknowledged. The air inside the house felt still, almost frozen in place, and she began to recognize how deeply that stillness mirrored the emotional climate surrounding her. She walked past closed doors and untouched rooms, spaces designed for conversation, laughter, and warmth, yet they stood quiet, untouched by affection, untouched by togetherness. She could feel the subtle emotional divide in every step, the distance that grew wider even as walls stood only a few feet apart. The home was filled with beauty, but beauty meant nothing when layered over emptiness. Each surface glowed, each corner gleamed, yet the deeper truth lingered in the silence that followed her wherever she went. Sometimes, as she crossed the hallway, she imagined what it would feel like to walk alongside someone who truly saw her, someone who valued her voice, her identity, her being. But instead, she felt the presence of indifference moving past her like a shadow that never paused long enough to notice she was there. The world around her expected composure, demanded grace, insisted she embody quiet strength even as she felt herself slowly fading into the background. And although she carried herself with dignity, the ache of invisibility followed closely, shaping each step, each breath, each moment she spent inside the place that once promised belonging. The hallway became symbolic, a corridor between who she once believed she was within this life and who she was slowly becoming as she faced its truth. It was a path she walked every day, yet each time it felt slightly different, as if the silence gained weight with time, layering itself over her spirit. She remembered when this space felt alive, when footsteps overlapping meant companionship instead of avoidance, when voices filled the air instead of drifting away into quiet distance. But now, she felt like she was moving through a world where she existed alongside another life without ever truly being part of it. There was a heaviness in knowing that neglect can hide inside routine, in realizing that emotional distance can grow not through conflict, but through absence, through indifference, through the expectation that she would continue walking forward no matter how deeply unseen she became. She felt the subtle imbalance in every encounter, the unspoken hierarchy that shaped how she was treated, not through loud dismissal but through quiet disregard. And within that quiet disregard lived something deeper, something that echoed beyond personal neglect, an attitude shaped by bias, by perception, by the belief that her role was to adapt silently rather than be acknowledged fully. As she walked, she thought about how often she had been told to remain patient, to stay composed, to accept circumstances rather than challenge them, as if endurance were her only value, as if resilience existed solely for the comfort of others. She understood now that strength did not mean tolerating invisibility, and dignity did not mean sacrificing her humanity to protect an image that was never meant to honor her truth. The hallway stretched ahead like a metaphor for her life in that moment, forward movement without companionship, progress without connection, existence without recognition. Yet even in that emptiness, something within her remained firm. She carried with her the unbreakable sense of identity she had nurtured long before this life, the knowledge of who she was beyond these walls, the history embedded within her spirit, the resilience rooted in generations before her. That heritage walked beside her even when no one else did. It reminded her that although neglect attempted to diminish her presence, it could not erase her essence. Still, no amount of strength could hide how deeply isolation cut, how emotionally exhausting it was to exist in a home that expected silence instead of acknowledgement. She sensed now that the distance between appearances and truth had become too large to ignore. The outside world might have seen elegance and order, but within these hallways lived the reality of erasure, a reality shaped by emotional abandonment and quiet prejudice, by subtle reminders that her presence was tolerated rather than valued. And with each passing day, she grew more aware that the life she walked through was not simply lonely, it was unjust. As her footsteps carried her forward, a quiet realization settled within her. She was no longer just walking through a hallway. She was moving through the truth of her existence, confronted by the reality that silence had been allowed to replace compassion for far too long. And though she still moved gently, still carried grace in every step, a transformation was beginning beneath the surface. A shift that whispered that one day, these quiet walks through emptiness would no longer define her life. Because even in isolation, even in neglect, even in spaces where she was expected to remain unseen, a part of her spirit continued to rise, steady, patient, unbreakable, waiting for the moment when her truth would no longer be carried in silence, but would finally step forward into the light. She eventually found herself sitting quietly on the edge of the sofa, the room around her wrapped in soft, muted light. And as she sank gently into the cushions, a stillness settled over her, not the silence of neglect but a reflective calm, the kind that arrives when truth can no longer be ignored. The phone rested in her hand, its weight feeling heavier than it ever had before, not because of the device itself, but because of everything it now represented. Memory, evidence, identity, presence in a world that had tried to render her invisible. She sat there for a long moment, letting the quiet fill the space, and she realized that somewhere along the journey, taking photos had become more than habit. It had become a way of holding onto herself when everything around her made her feel as though she were disappearing. The room carried an air of subdued elegance, the delicate gold accents, the luxurious textures, the carefully placed decor, yet none of it brought warmth or belonging. Instead, it reminded her how much effort had been spent perfecting appearance while neglecting the emotional foundation beneath it. She lifted the phone slowly, not with vanity or performance, but with a kind of reverence, as if capturing this moment meant acknowledging the truth she had been forced to carry in silence. Her face appeared on the screen, calm and composed, yet behind that composure lived a quiet reservoir of exhaustion, strength, and unspoken resilience. This was not the face of someone untouched by sorrow. It was the face of someone who had endured it with dignity. She didn't smile, she didn't force expression. She simply allowed herself to exist exactly as she was, present, steady, dignified, and deeply human. The camera reflected a woman surrounded by beauty yet starved of acknowledgement, a woman who had learned to remain strong while the world around her drifted further away from the responsibility of seeing her. For months, she had taken photos almost instinctively, but in this moment she finally understood why. Each one had been a quiet declaration that she still existed, that she still mattered, that even if her presence was erased in conversation, in emotion, in partnership, she would not vanish entirely. The image she captured now felt different, heavier, fuller in meaning. It held everything she had endured, the silence, the subtle dismissals, the quiet erosion of identity hidden behind elegance and privilege. It held the tension between the life others admired and the truth she lived privately. It held the quiet ache of invisibility and the unwavering strength that had allowed her to survive it. And for the first time, she didn't take the photo to document pain, she took it to confront it. As she sat there, phone resting softly in her hand again, she studied the image closely, letting her eyes linger on the expression staring back at her. She saw truth there, a truth too complex for words, too easily overlooked by those who never had to live it. She saw the story of someone who had carried resilience not by choice but by expectation, who had been told implicitly through silence and distance that her feelings were secondary to appearances, that her identity could be softened to make others comfortable. But this image refused to soften anything. It showed her reality exactly as it was: powerful, quiet, painful, and undeniable. In that moment, she became aware of how deeply racial bias can hide within personal spaces. not always through accusations or confrontation, but through the expectation that she exist without acknowledgement, that she remain composed even when her humanity is dismissed. The neglect she experienced did not exist in isolation. It was shaped by a system of perception that assumed her strength, minimized her vulnerability, and rationalized her erasure. The photo captured that truth, the quiet injustice of being unseen inside a life that others believed should protect her. Her heart felt heavy yet steady. The moment no longer belonged to pain alone, it belonged to awakening. She realized that these photos had become pieces of a story that no one else had cared to notice, a story she had been living quietly, a story built from moments of resilience that should never have been required. And though the world around her still appeared composed, something inside her had shifted. She no longer saw herself as a silent figure trapped within a beautiful life, but as a woman standing at the threshold of understanding, slowly reclaiming the right to exist fully and unapologetically. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply, allowing herself to feel everything she had spent so long pushing aside, the loneliness, the strength, the exhaustion, the quiet hope that something inside this truth could eventually transform. And when she opened them again, the photo remained in her hand like a mirror of her spirit, reminding her that dignity does not hide pain, it carries it with courage. She did not yet know what this moment would lead to, or how deeply the ripple of truth would travel beyond the quiet walls of that room. But she could feel that the path ahead was no longer defined solely by silence. Something had begun, not loud, not defiant, but unmistakable. A shift, a realization, a quiet step toward visibility. And as she sat there, surrounded by luxury yet grounded in truth, she understood that this single image was more than a reflection. It was a turning point, the moment where her story no longer lived only in shadows but began to gather the strength it needed to finally be seen. She sat quietly with the phone resting in her hands, scrolling through the images she had taken over the passing months, and with each photograph she revisited, the truth became clearer. These were not just moments captured in time, they were fragments of her existence, silent proof that she had been here all along, living, enduring, feeling, even when the world around her treated her as though she were invisible. In every image, she recognized a version of herself holding strength beneath isolation, dignity beneath neglect, resilience beneath the quiet erosion of recognition. And as she looked closer, she began to see how the story of her life had been preserved through these pictures long before she consciously realized why she took them. Some photos showed her standing near windows where sunlight traced faint lines across her features, and even in those softly lit frames, she could see the distance in her expression, not dramatic or outwardly distressed, but quiet, restrained, reflective, the kind of expression worn by someone who has grown used to containing emotions the world refuses to acknowledge. Other images showed her seated in elegant rooms, surrounded by beauty that appeared warm on the surface but carried a hollowness beneath it, a hollowness that mirrored the silence in her life. Each photograph, though still, seemed to echo with the same unspoken feeling. Presence without acknowledgement, existence without recognition, strength carried in isolation. As she studied the progression of images, she noticed how subtly her posture had changed over time. In earlier photos, there was still a hint of openness in the way she carried herself, a quiet hope that perhaps the silence would fade, that distance would close, that connection might return. But gradually, as the pictures moved forward through time, that openness shifted into guarded composure, into restraint, into a careful stillness that came from learning to protect herself in a space where vulnerability offered no safety. It was not weakness she saw, it was adaptation, the way a person learns to minimize the parts of themselves that repeatedly go unnoticed. The more she looked, the more she understood that these photos had become evidence not of vanity but of survival. They told the story others refused to see, a story of endurance inside a life that celebrated image while erasing emotion. A story of a woman forced to hold her identity together in a place that kept trying to soften, reshape, or disregard it. The photos revealed the truth without words, how silence can fracture a spirit, how neglect can transform into erasure, how invisibility does not mean absence but rather the painful reality of being present while others choose not to acknowledge you. She realized then that invisibility does not appear suddenly. It grows quietly, layer by layer, through repeated moments of dismissal, through subtle exclusions, through the slow normalization of being overlooked. Each image held one of those layers, the loneliness of empty rooms, the emotional distance carved into everyday routines, the resilience she carried because the world around her refused to share the weight of her existence. And as she sat there, scrolling through those captured fragments of time, she could no longer deny what the collection represented. A life that looked full from the outside yet remained painfully hollow where it mattered most. Her heart tightened as she recognized how deeply racial bias wove itself into these moments, not in obvious or overt ways, but through the expectation that she remain composed and uncomplaining, that she endure neglect silently, that her pain remained secondary to the preservation of comfort, status, and image. She saw how resilience had been assumed of her, how strength had been taken for granted, how her humanity had been reduced to quiet endurance rather than acknowledged as deserving of compassion and equality. The photographs became more than personal memories, they became mirrors of injustice, reflections of how easily invisibility can be normalized when shaped by power and prejudice. Yet within every image she also saw something else, something powerful, something unbroken. Even in her quiet sadness there was dignity in her expression, a grace that did not come from submission but from the refusal to let erasure define her entirely. She realized that despite the environment around her, she had never stopped being herself. She had only learned to survive within circumstances that sought to diminish her. And as she recognized that truth, a deep strength stirred inside her, a strength not born from endurance alone, but from awareness, from understanding, from reclaiming the meaning of her own existence. She lingered on one particular photo, the one she had taken most recently, the one where her eyes reflected both weariness and clarity, and she understood that this image was different because it no longer represented silent endurance. It represented awakening. It represented the moment where invisibility stopped being something she quietly accepted and instead became something she could finally see for what it was. And once seen, it could no longer be ignored. The room around her remained quiet, yet the silence now felt transformed, no longer a force pressing against her spirit, but a space in which truth had finally begun to speak. The photos were not just records of where she had been, they were a map tracing the journey from uncertainty to awareness, from confusion to clarity, from quiet endurance to emerging self-recognition. They were the evidence of a life that deserved acknowledgement and of a woman who, even after everything, still possessed the strength to confront her reality with courage. She did not yet know what she would do with this truth or where it would lead, but she knew that invisibility no longer held the same power over her. The proof was in her hands, undeniable, tangible, unfiltered. And as she looked at those images one last time, she felt a quiet resolve rising within her. She understood that the world around her might still try to dismiss or reinterpret her experience, but the truth embedded in those photographs could not be erased. Because they showed more than isolation, they showed resilience, they showed presence, they showed a woman who refused to disappear even when silence tried to cover her existence. And in that realization, she felt the first true shift within herself. A growing certainty that the story she had carried alone for so long was finally beginning to transform, gathering the strength it needed to move beyond quiet survival toward something far more powerful. Visibility, recognition, and the courage to no longer remain silent about the life she had been forced to endure. She stepped into the grand social gathering, a space filled with polished elegance, glittering lights, and carefully arranged smiles, yet the moment she entered, she felt the familiar shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change that reminded her she was seen but not truly welcomed. Conversations floated through the air like distant echoes, laughter circled through clusters of well-dressed guests, and yet she stood slightly apart, her presence acknowledged only as an extension of the world she was expected to represent rather than as a woman with a story, a voice, and a life of her own. People glanced at her in fleeting moments, polite smiles, brief nods, eyes that lingered just long enough to assess rather than connect, and she recognized the quiet, unspoken layer of judgment woven beneath their gestures, the kind that wrapped itself not only around who she was, but around what she represented in their eyes. The room was full of confidence and power, yet within that power lived an undercurrent of exclusion. She could feel it in the way certain conversations shifted when she approached, in the guarded way others observed her as if her presence required explanation, as if she needed to justify the space she occupied. It was not loud or aggressive, it was subtle, controlled, refined, the kind of bias that hides behind sophistication, concealed beneath polite tones and socially acceptable distance. She stood there, composed and dignified, knowing that even in this place of luxury and wealth, she existed beneath layers of expectation that others would never feel pressing against their spirit. Her identity, strong, rooted, unshakably her own, became filtered through perception that had little to do with who she truly was. She noticed the way some people's expressions softened into politely restrained curiosity, the way whispers seemed to float behind her after she walked past, the way a few eyes flickered with doubt not because of anything she did, but simply because of who she was. It was a reminder that even standing in the same room, even sharing the same air, she was not standing on equal ground. She was being observed, measured against stereotypes she never agreed to carry, framed within assumptions shaped by prejudice rather than truth. Conversations unfolded around her, yet she was rarely invited into their center. Her insights, when spoken, were often met with nods that felt rehearsed, acknowledgments that ended the moment she finished speaking rather than opening space for her perspective to matter. She could feel the imbalance in every interaction, the quiet dismissal, the selective awareness, the way her presence was appreciated visually but not valued emotionally or intellectually. It was as if she existed as part of the scene but not as part of the experience, present but detached, visible yet unseen. She stood with grace, her posture calm and composed, but inside she felt the weight of a truth that extended beyond personal neglect, a truth that lived in countless experiences like this one, where racial bias did not appear through confrontation but through exclusion disguised as civility. It was woven into the way people spoke around her rather than with her, into the way space was shared physically but not socially, into the quiet signals that reminded her she was allowed to exist in the room but not fully belong within it. The luxury around her could not hide that reality. The chandeliers, fine fabrics, and carefully arranged decor only amplified the contrast between what the world believed this environment represented and what she truly felt standing inside it. She thought about how many others had experienced the same truth, how many had stood in rooms where their presence was expected, yet their identity was treated as symbolic rather than genuine, how many had carried the silent burden of dignity while enduring subtle exclusion that others would never recognize because it was never meant to be visible to those who benefited from it. She moved gently through the crowd, each step measured, each breath steady, aware of how deeply this pattern echoed the isolation she experienced at home. It was the same distance, only reflected in a different setting, the same expectation to remain composed, the same quiet undermining of her existence, the same unspoken insistence that she hold herself with unwavering strength while others disregarded the weight she carried. Whether within private walls or public gatherings, the message remained the same: she was present but not fully seen, included but not fully accepted. Yet even in this environment, surrounded by intentful indifference, she did not shrink. She grounded herself in her identity, the richness of her heritage, the strength in her history, the resilience passed through generations who had endured far greater erasure and still refused to disappear. That strength lived in her expression, in the calm stillness of her posture, in the grace that rose not from compliance, but from the refusal to let exclusion define her worth. She understood that her dignity was not granted by the world around her. It was something she carried within, unbroken and unwavering, no matter how persistently she was treated as less than whole. But even that strength could not erase the ache of knowing that injustice existed not only in harsh moments, but also in refined ones, in polished rooms where polite voices masked prejudice, where bias wore the disguise of sophistication, where inequality thrived beneath carefully controlled civility. She saw clearly now that the emotional distance she endured was part of a much larger pattern, one that stretched beyond individual behavior and into the structures that defined how certain lives were valued and others quietly diminished. Standing in that room, surrounded by voices that flowed around her without ever truly including her, she felt the weight of that reality settle deeper into her understanding. It was not anger that filled her, it was clarity, the unmistakable recognition that her experience was not a misunderstanding, not an exaggeration, not something imagined. It was real, it was repeated. And it was a truth the world too often chose not to see. Yet even as that clarity grew stronger, so did something within her, a quiet determination, a rising strength, a deepening awareness that she no longer carried this truth in confusion but with purpose. The distance around her no longer felt like an unanswered question. It felt like evidence, a reflection of a deeper injustice she now fully recognized. And as she stood there, calm, dignified, unbroken, she understood that every moment like this brought her closer to a point where silence would no longer hold her in place, where awareness would no longer live quietly inside her, where her story would no longer remain hidden behind the polished facade of rooms like these, because truth, once fully seen, does not fade back into invisibility. It only grows stronger, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. The evening air outside the mansion felt heavy as she stepped beneath the dim glow of the dusk sky, and though the world around her appeared calm and undisturbed, she felt the deepening distance settle more sharply within her spirit than ever before. The entrance stood tall and imposing, framed by stone columns and quiet shadows, yet instead of feeling like a place of safety or belonging, it felt like a threshold between two worlds. The one others believed she lived in, and the one she actually endured in silence. The fading light cast long silhouettes across the ground, stretching farther than her presence ever seemed allowed to reach, and in that fragile moment between daylight and darkness, she felt the truth of her isolation press against her like a cold wind she could no longer escape. She paused near the entrance, letting the quiet settle around her, and realized how deeply the emotional distance had woven itself into every part of her life. The absence she felt was no longer contained within conversations or interactions. It had become a constant presence, lingering in her thoughts, echoing in every silent exchange, shaping the way she moved through the world. Even when she stood only a few steps away from the life she was supposed to share, it felt as though miles stretched between them, as though an invisible barrier remained fixed in place, preventing closeness from ever returning. The stillness of the evening made that divide feel sharper, clearer, impossible to deny. She thought about how often she had tried to bridge that distance, how many times she had reached out with patience, compassion, understanding, hoping that acknowledgement might return in some form, even if only briefly. But the more she reached forward, the more she realized she was the only one extending effort, the only one carrying the emotional weight of connection, the only one trying to preserve something that no longer reflected mutual care. The imbalance became unmistakable. She was holding together a space that was no longer meant to hold her. The world beyond the entrance remained quiet, yet inside her thoughts, memories replayed like gentle storms. She remembered all the small moments that had once seemed insignificant, unanswered messages, unfinished conversations, glances that drifted past her rather than toward her, each one a thread that had gradually unwoven the fabric of their connection. Standing there beneath the dim light, she saw how every thread had led to this widening emptiness, this silence that now defined everything left between them. There was a unique kind of loneliness that came from being physically near someone yet emotionally distant, and that loneliness wrapped around her now with undeniable weight. It was not the loneliness of being alone. It was the loneliness of being unseen in the presence of another, the loneliness of existing beside a life that refused to acknowledge her existence with the depth and equality she deserved. That kind of loneliness does not echo loudly. It settles slowly, quietly, deeply, until it becomes part of the air you breathe. She could feel how the emotional distance carried deeper meanings than the surface revealed. It was not merely neglect, it was dismissal rooted in assumptions that her endurance required no support, in expectations that her strength would sustain itself without care. Beneath that dismissal lived something far more complex, something shaped by bias, by the subtle ways identity can be overlooked when filtered through privilege, power, and perception. The silence she experienced did not exist apart from those forces, it grew within them. The evening sky darkened slowly and the world around her faded into soft shadows, yet within that darkness, a new clarity formed. She understood now that the distance between them was not a misunderstanding, not a conflict that time alone could repair. It was a choice to remain detached rather than accountable, a choice to value image over connection, a choice that revealed how easily her needs and humanity had been placed beneath everything else. That realization hurt, but it also freed her from doubt. She wrapped her arms around herself gently, not out of weakness but as a small act of self-comfort, a quiet acknowledgement that even if no one else offered warmth or recognition, she still deserved to feel whole. The entrance before her no longer looked like a gateway to belonging. It looked like a monument to all the moments where acknowledgement should have been given but never arrived. Yet instead of shrinking beneath that truth, she felt a deeper awareness rise slowly inside her, steady, grounded, unshakable. The distance that once confused her now revealed itself with undeniable clarity. It was no longer a question she was trying to answer, it was an answer she could finally name. And in naming it, she reclaimed something within herself, something that had been quietly stifled beneath months of silence. Awareness did not erase the pain, but it transformed the way she carried it. She stood there in the quiet evening air, breathing slowly, letting the stillness settle not as a burden but as understanding. The world around her remained unchanged, the house tall, the path still, the sky fading into night, yet inside her, a shift continued to unfold. She no longer saw the emotional distance as a reflection of her worth, no longer blamed herself for the emptiness surrounding her. Instead, she saw it as the reflection of a world that had failed to honor her presence, to respect her identity, to value her humanity within the relationship it claimed to hold. And even as that realization deepened, so too did a quiet resolve, not loud, not aggressive, but steady and undeniable. She understood that she could no longer remain anchored to a life defined by distance, no longer allow silence to shape the truth of who she was. The dusk sky above her marked more than the end of a day, it marked the fading of illusion, the slow dissolution of a narrative she had been expected to accept without question. As the last traces of daylight disappeared and darkness gently settled over the entrance, she remained standing with dignity, with clarity, with the unspoken certainty that something within her life was reaching a turning point. The emotional distance may have deepened, but so had her awareness, her strength, her readiness to confront the truth that could no longer be hidden beneath silence. And in that quiet moment beneath the evening sky, she understood. The more the distance grew around her, the closer she moved toward the moment when everything would finally come to light. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere felt even heavier than the evening air outside, and as she stepped back into the vast, glass-framed interior, she became strikingly aware of how the environment itself reflected the imbalance that shaped her life. The tall glass walls surrounded her like transparent barriers, beautiful but distant, elegant yet cold, revealing everything yet offering nothing of the warmth or closeness a home should hold. The space seemed to exist for display rather than connection, designed to impress others rather than nurture the lives inside it. And in that realization, she felt the quiet truth press deeper into her spirit. She lived in a world that prioritized image long before it ever considered her humanity. She stood still for a moment, letting her eyes travel across the room, the polished floors, the curated art, the carefully staged perfection, and she felt how profoundly disconnected it all was from the emotional reality she carried. Nothing in this space reflected her voice, her experience, or her identity. Instead, it reflected control, structure, and power, a world built to appear flawless even when its foundation was shaped by silence, neglect, and dismissal. The more she looked around, the clearer it became that this was not simply a home lacking affection. It was a world in which she existed only as long as she maintained composure, beauty, and compliance. She felt the quiet imbalance everywhere, not only in the emotional distance between two people, but in the unspoken hierarchy that determined who was allowed to take up space, who was allowed to speak freely, who was expected to adapt, soften, and shrink in order to maintain harmony. Her presence was acknowledged visually but not valued emotionally, noticed yet rarely heard, positioned within the life yet never centered within it. And beneath that imbalance lived a deeper truth, one shaped not only by personal neglect but by privilege and perception, by the subtle ways bias can decide whose identity deserves validation and whose existence is tolerated only in silence. As she stood framed between the glass walls, she felt like part of the architecture itself, present, visible, yet emotionally detached from the world around her. It was as if she had become another element of the environment, appreciated for aesthetics but not for humanity, included in appearance yet excluded in experience. The realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. For so long, she had questioned whether the distance she felt was temporary, whether the silence was simply circumstance. But now, she saw how deeply it was rooted, how it had become part of the structure of her life, not simply a moment within it. She remembered the conversations that never fully included her, the decisions made without her insight, the subtle redirections whenever she attempted to assert her voice. Each instance, though small on its own, had accumulated into something undeniable, a pattern that defined her place within this world. It was never said aloud, yet always present. She was expected to remain steady, quiet, composed, admired, but not fully acknowledged. And the more she recognized that pattern, the more she understood that it extended far beyond one relationship. It reflected a larger truth about how some voices are minimized, how some identities are undervalued, how some people are expected to exist without demanding visibility. Her heart felt heavy as she acknowledged how racial bias intertwined with that imbalance, not through overt hostility but through subtle expectations, through the assumption that her strength required no care, through the belief that she should adapt to an environment that was never built to include the fullness of who she was. The silence she endured had been shaped not only by emotional neglect, but by a system of perception that treated her resilience as a given and her pain as unnecessary to address. And yet, even as she confronted that truth, she felt something powerful rise within her, not anger but clarity, not defiance but awakening. She no longer viewed herself as someone failing to fit into this world. She saw now that the world itself had failed to make space for her humanity. The imbalance was not hers to carry as self-doubt. It was evidence of a deeper injustice shaped by power, privilege, and protected image. She took a slow breath and allowed herself to feel everything: the exhaustion of invisibility, the strength of survival, the grief of being erased inside a life that promised unity but delivered isolation. The glass around her reflected her silhouette back at her, and in that faint reflection she saw not a diminished woman, but a woman who had endured more than anyone outside these walls would ever understand, and who, despite it all, still stood with dignity, presence, and unwavering inner truth. The space no longer intimidated her. Instead, it revealed itself for what it truly was, not a symbol of success, but a reminder of the distance between appearance and reality, between image and truth, between the life others believed she lived and the one she quietly survived. And as she stood there, framed by glass, surrounded by silence, she sensed that the imbalance that once felt overwhelming was now becoming something else: a catalyst, a reason to question, a spark of transformation growing steadily within her. The world around her might still appear flawless, but inside her spirit, the truth had taken root, and once truth takes root, it cannot remain silent forever. Because sooner or later, imbalance demands to be confronted and invisibility demands to be seen. She looked down at the phone again, her most recent photo glowing softly in her hand, and for the first time she felt the full weight of what that image carried. It was more than a quiet moment captured in isolation. It was truth layered across time, a reflection of every silent day she had endured. The expression in her eyes revealed strength, exhaustion, and awakening all at once, and as she studied it, she understood that this single image held the story others had refused to see. It was the moment where invisibility transformed into undeniable evidence, where silence took shape and could no longer be softened into excuses or misunderstanding. The photo did not scream, yet it spoke louder than words ever could, revealing the distance, neglect, and quiet erasure she had carried inside. And as she held it, she felt a shift within her, the understanding that she could no longer question whether what she felt was real. It was real, it had been real all along. And now it existed not just in memory but in proof the world could not easily dismiss. She hesitated before sharing the photo, her heart steady yet uncertain, knowing that once the truth left her hands, it would no longer live quietly in her private world. But something inside her guided the decision, not out of anger or defiance, but out of a deep need to finally be seen. When the image began to circulate, it moved farther than she expected, finding its way into conversations, screens, and spaces that had once ignored her existence. People paused when they saw it. Some felt empathy, others felt discomfort, yet no one could pretend the illusion remained perfect. The image disrupted the narrative that had protected silence, exposing the fracture beneath the polished surface. She did not speak, and still the truth spoke for her. The world had admired the life surrounding her, but now, for the first time, it was forced to acknowledge the reality that had been hidden within it, a reality shaped by neglect, bias, and erasure that could no longer remain unseen. As reactions echoed outward, she stood in the center of a vast, empty room, the silence around her feeling heavier than ever before. The world beyond the walls had finally glimpsed her reality, yet inside she was left facing the depth of everything she had endured. The room felt hollow, the air weighted with memories of moments where acknowledgement should have existed but never arrived. She understood now that the loneliness she carried was not imagined. It was built into the very structure of the life surrounding her. The distance, the dismissal, the quiet erasure had not been accidental. It had been allowed to exist, protected by image and power. Standing there, she felt sorrow rise through her chest, not only for herself, but for every unspoken moment she had endured in silence. The collapse was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and profoundly human, the moment when emotional truth could no longer remain buried beneath composure. The days that followed revealed just how deeply denial could shape the world around her. Some people chose compassion, yet many responded with resistance, questioning her pain, reframing her experience, and reshaping the truth to protect the comfort of those who benefited from it. They preferred the illusion, the polished facade, the version of her life that required no accountability. Their reactions mirrored the same injustice she had lived: dismissal disguised as civility, doubt disguised as reason, silence disguised as order. She watched as conversations shifted away from truth and toward preservation of image, and she realized that what she faced was larger than one relationship. It was part of a system that would rather invalidate a woman's experience than confront the discomfort of acknowledging inequality. And though their resistance hurt, it also revealed something undeniable: the problem had never been her voice. The problem had always been the world's refusal to listen. Yet even as resistance surrounded her, something within her began to rise, calm and unwavering, like strength rediscovering its own name. She no longer questioned whether she deserved acknowledgement; she knew she did. The pain she carried transformed into clarity, and clarity became resolve. She understood now that her worth had never depended on whether others chose to see her. It existed beyond neglect, beyond bias, beyond silence. The truth that once felt heavy now became empowering, guiding her toward a deeper sense of self that no erasure could diminish. She stood taller, not in defiance but in self-recognition, reclaiming the parts of herself that had been pushed aside. The turning point did not arrive through confrontation, it arrived through understanding. And with that understanding, she stepped forward from the shadows of invisibility with quiet courage, knowing that from this moment on, she would no longer disappear inside anyone else's silence. With clarity settling firmly in her spirit, she took a quiet step forward, both emotionally and within her life, recognizing that remaining inside a world that erased her would only continue to diminish who she was. The decision did not come from anger but from self-respect, a recognition that love cannot exist where humanity is overlooked. She no longer saw silence as something she needed to endure. Instead, she understood it as a boundary she no longer had to accept. Each moment of neglect, each unanswered presence, each quiet dismissal now stood in sharp contrast to the worth she carried within herself. And so, she began to create distance, not to escape but to reclaim. The separation formed slowly, deliberately, with dignity, as she chose to step away from the illusion rather than continue disappearing within it. For the first time, she felt control returning to her life, not through confrontation but through truth. She did not leave behind strength, she walked with it. And as she moved forward, she knew this choice marked the beginning of a path where her identity would no longer be overshadowed by silence but allowed to exist in its fullness. In the quiet dawn of a new day, she walked beyond the spaces that once confined her, carrying with her a sense of independence that felt both unfamiliar and deeply freeing. The world outside the life she left behind did not feel overwhelming. It felt open, unbound, filled with air she could finally breathe without restraint. Each step reminded her that identity is never meant to survive in isolation. It is meant to live, expand, and exist without apology. She no longer measured herself through the lens of neglect or through expectations shaped by others. Instead, she grounded herself in her history, her voice, her heritage, and the strength that had always lived within her, even in silence. The absence of noise around her no longer felt empty, it felt peaceful. The loneliness she once carried transformed into space for healing, reflection, and renewal. And though the past still lingered in memory, it no longer defined her present. She was no longer a figure surviving within someone else's world. She was a woman returning to her own. Time unfolded gently, allowing healing to grow at its own pace, not through grand transformation but through quiet moments of self-care, reflection, and truth. She learned to sit with the parts of herself that had been ignored, offering compassion to the wounds silence once deepened. The strength she carried did not feel like armor anymore, it felt like grounding, like a connection to everything that made her who she was. She found comfort in simple moments, in stillness that no longer felt burdensome, in the realization that healing was not about forgetting what happened, but about reclaiming the parts of herself that had been overshadowed. The world around her slowly began to feel less heavy, and in that weight lifting, she discovered that resilience is not about enduring neglect. It is about choosing yourself when the world refuses to. Her spirit no longer bent itself to be accepted. Instead, it stood centered in authenticity, guided by a quiet strength that could not be diminished again. And in that calm, she understood that she had not lost herself, she had finally returned to herself. As her story quietly reached others, it resonated far beyond her own experience, echoing in the lives of those who had endured similar erasure in different forms. People who had once felt unseen found reflection in her journey, recognizing how invisibility can exist even in places that appear privileged or admired. Conversations began to shift, softly at first, then with deeper honesty, acknowledging the way bias can live inside relationships, inside expectations, inside the spaces where identity should be embraced rather than minimized. Her truth became more than personal. It became a reminder of the countless voices who had been silenced beneath composure, strength, and quiet endurance. And though the world did not change overnight, awareness grew, awareness of how easily dignity can be overlooked, and how vital it is to confront injustice even when it hides behind elegance and civility. Her journey did not simply expose neglect. It illuminated a deeper reality, one that called others to reflect, to question, to finally see what had too long remained unseen. Standing in the stillness of her new life, she felt both the weight of everything she had endured and the strength of everything she had become. The scars remained, but they no longer spoke of pain, they spoke of survival, of truth, of a woman who refused to disappear inside silence. Her story was not a story of loss but of awakening, a journey from erasure to recognition, from invisibility to self-presence. She knew others still lived within the shadows she had escaped, still carrying quiet wounds behind perfect images and silent rooms. And as she looked forward, she carried one unspoken question, one meant not only for herself but for the world that had once overlooked her. How many more lives must endure this quiet injustice before we finally choose to see, to listen, and to change? Her story did not fade into silence. It stood as a living truth, a reminder that strength is not found in enduring erasure, but in refusing to let it define who you are.